Warning: this is a true crime channel and is not for the faint of heart or the easily impressionable. This video may contain details that some viewers may find highly disturbing. Viewer discretion is strongly advised. You have been warned.
Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel where I still don't have any of the proper equipment, I refuse to follow the script, and where it is colder than a zombie's cunt outside. I wasn't aware I lived in the fucking Arctic tundra. One moment, my lovely horde. Ah, much better. Anyway, I hope everyone had a great New Year's. I had a rather quiet one myself, which I personally didn't mind. I asked you guys in my last video to give me some names of killers and crimes you wanted to hear about, and my, have you spoken. I now have a nice little list going, and I will be doing the request you gave me in a random order, so there's still some element of surprise. I am also happy to say that I will be tossing in a few psychological blunders and rather gruesome experiments into the mix of the channel, just to keep things interesting and fresh. Hopefully you all will enjoy those stories as well. And I am sorry, you guys, for the delay and that you are acting as my guinea pigs until I get proper equipment and get my shit together. I sincerely hope you don't mind. For today's story, let's just say I may have spoke too soon in my last video with my little quip about Albert Fish. I fear he has been outclassed on my list of infamy. Also, all information I will be using was obtained with the generous help of Brad and Liam from the Naked Zombie channel. They're a couple of Australian gentlemen who speak on all things paranormal as well as many other topics. So go on over and show them some love and my thanks to them. I will put the link to their channel in the description below. Now, seeing as my intro is for once under 5 minutes, let us get into this bloodbath before I start to ramble, shall we? You know the drill, my murderous horde. Grab yourself a beer, sit back, relax, and let's have ourselves a little conversation. Our story begins in a place far from most others. In fact, it is so far from the majority of all other land masses that it has secured itself an almost complete immunity to destruction in the event of a massive nuclear fallout. Granted, in retrospect, they do miss a lot of death metal concert tours. Yes, my horde, I am speaking of none other than Australia, for it was between the years of 1992 and 1999 in a small town called Snowtown that the grisly case of true infamy took place. One that you might expect to come straight out of the mind of H.P. Lovecraft. A 7-year span of torture, dismemberment, and even cannibalism that left 12 dead and horrifically dismembered. Murders that horrified an entire country and rocked a sleepy town to its very foundations. Yes, my bloodthirsty darlings, I am speaking of none other than the Bodies in Barrels case. The culprit of this particular murder spree was none other than John Bunting, Robert Wagner, Mark Hayden, and James Blaskus, sorry if I mispronounced that, between August of 92 and May of 99, respectively, in South Australia, and have committed the most horrific murders I have heard of to date. Yes, I'm afraid old Albert has officially lost his #1 spot in my list of sheer infamy due to the depravity and gore that John Bunting, along with his pack of murderous minions, has committed. And I must say, together they have such a bloodlust between them that it would make even Charles Manson envious. The Snowtown murders, also known as the Bodies in Barrels murders, were the murders of 12 people in South Australia. The crimes were uncovered when the remains of 8 victims were found in barrels of acid located in a rented-out former bank building in Snowtown, South Australia, on May 20th of 99. The town of Snowtown is in the mid-north of the South Australia area, about 145 kilometers north of Adelaide. Though Snowtown is frequently linked with these crimes, it actually has very little to do with them. For you see, only those 8 bodies were found in Snowtown in early 1999, and that was actually very late in the crime spree that had actually spanned several years prior. Only 1 victim was actually killed in that town. None of the other victims nor the perpetrators were from that area. The 8 bodies were found in plastic barrels and in a rented-out vault on May 20th, as I stated. 3 days later, 2 more bodies were found buried in the backyard in Salisbury North, a suburb of Adelaide. By the end of June, 9 of the 10 victims had been identified, or then 10 victims. The discoveries followed by a lengthy covert criminal investigation by the South Australian police. During the investigation, 2 mysterious deaths already known to authorities were actually found to be linked and perpetrated by the murderers, at that time known as the Snowtown murderers. A total of 4 people were arrested and charged over these 12 murders. All were convicted of the murders or assisting in them. This group was largely influenced by their ringleader, John Justin Bunting. Much detail, however, has not been made public, with the case having been subject to over 250 suppression orders, many of which has not been lifted yet. So, as you can imagine, finding straight answers on this case was not an easy task, hence why I had to actually outsource some of my research to the Naked Zombie channel. What is interesting about this case is how once again the mold is broken in regards to the more common practices of the serial killer. And even this one included some rare practices that have, to my knowledge, only been seen in more solitary serial killers. Firstly, while serial killer duos do happen, it is not often that the partnership to exceed 2 or even 3 individuals at any given time. The fact that at one point there was as many as 5 in this group, I find it not only interesting but also rather odd, as such killers tend to have antisocial behaviors, and normally such duos, when they do occur, are more often than not made up of family members, that being sisters, brothers, and even cousins. Parent and child duos are often also seen, but that's not a topic I can get into at this time, as that deserves its own video. There are a few duos that are lovers, but again, that's a subject for a later date, and one that also needs its own video. It's quite a lengthy discussion. Perhaps I'll save it for Valentine's Day. Back to the original topic, in the case of the Snowtown killings, not only does it stand out as being an oddity for the actions of a larger group, and it having spanned the greater part of a decade without detection, mind you, which I suspect is due to the fact that these killers managed to keep cashing the security benefits of their victims, but also their choice of victims is rather interesting. Now, while all serial killers have their own taste, for lack of a better word, in targets, and some are even incredibly particular in said victims, this case to me is interesting due to the fact while most killers stay within their own sexuality, John Bunting and his crew did not. In fact, they targeted whomever they deemed as pedophiles, homosexual men, or just plain weak. Even the ages of their victims were scattered across the board, which is, again, another oddity, which would, in my eyes, be more akin to a mass murder or a killer swarm-like group as opposed to a serial killer group. That and the fact of that many, being 4, serial killers all congregating into one group and killing together is actually quite rare. And what's even more interesting is that John Bunting, the clear ringleader of his murderous pack, did not seem to see the difference between pedophilia and homosexuality. He also had a bit of a habit of straying away from his chosen type as well, as having several other people in his murderous group. And he also practiced several other habits not common in serial killers. In fact, I almost hesitate to call this particular group of serial killers, or even a duo of serial killers, as it was normally only 2 or maybe even 3 men doing the actual killing at one time, while the others would only participate in the disposal and later events. Now, while I would classify John Bunting as a serial killer by himself, even though his motive could be easily dismissed as material given the fact that he arranged it so he and his group could receive the checks of their victims, and an even more notable fact that strengthens my reasoning to classify Bunting as not only a serial killer but an incredibly cunning one at that, is his ability to not only change his methods from strangulation to even gunshot, but also to hide the bodies of his victims in remote locations, and even his ability to not only torment them as he killed them, but also managing to cause their families pain in certain cases. Not only that, but his ability to move his location and evade capture and detection for nearly 10 years shows that he does in fact very much fit the profile of a killer, and a rather good one at that. And he could have easily committed these acts by himself, which also throws into question why he found himself a group in the first place. It is my guess that he gathered a group around him to either help him blend in with society, or perhaps he enjoyed the company as more exhibitionist-like tendencies, perhaps. However, I find it much more likely that he in fact only wanted the company to sate the urge of his bragging, as he often did, which could arguably show forethought. That alone would suggest Bunting to be quite an intelligent and even perhaps a by far worse threat than any of us could imagine. Now, I'm not saying that I agree with what he did, and nor am I saying that he is by far an intelligent being. He could very well not be. However, I am rather morbidly curious as to what Bunting could have done by himself had he ever had the chance to truly act alone. I do fear, had that event occurred and had he not been captured, I do believe it is very likely that Australia could have had their very own Jack the Ripper in modern times. The other 3 in this group, however, I would not call serial killers at all, for the simple fact of the matter that it was John Bunting who triggered that pack mentality and convinced his group to join him in killing his victims. I think alone they possibly would have never done those things as individuals, but that it was actually Bunting who triggered that particular instinct within them. Now, some may argue that Charles Manson, another so-labeled serial killer, also did these things, and therefore would make it a notable habit of serial killers to kill in groups, and to that I would vehemently disagree. While I will explain my thoughts on the Manson murders and theories behind them on a later date, I will for now state that Manson, at least in my eyes, or to my knowledge, was not an active killer. In fact, to my knowledge, he more or less facilitated those murders that made him infamous, and in my own opinion, was more akin to a cult leader rather than a serial killer, and that his motives were, in fact, more political than material, unlike John Bunting. But let us go over the individuals involved in this infamous case, both the killers and the victims. John Justin Bunting, born September 4th in 1966 in Queensland, is an Australian serial killer from Adelaide, South Australia, currently serving 11 consecutive sentences of life imprisonment without the possibility of parole in the murders of 11 victims in the Snowtown murders. Bunting, driven to murder by his hatred for pedophiles, though I can't really blame him for his hatred of pedophiles, but doesn't mean you should go off killing them, and homosexuals, has been described as a skilled manipulator of people, which, again, as I stated before, does strengthen my opinion in that he could have very well acted alone. And he has also been dubbed Australia's worst serial killer, and personally I do agree. And I do believe it is quite clear as to why he targeted the people he did. When Bunting was 8 years old, he was beaten and sexually assaulted by a friend of an older brother. This would only grow worse in regards to Bunting's psyche as he aged. As a teenager, he reported that he enjoyed weaponry, photography, and anatomy. Not uncommon for a serial killer to enjoy those things. As a young adult, he developed a strong hatred of pedophiles and homosexuals for some reason. Again, I believe this was brought on by the trauma of his sexual assault at such a young age. At age 22, he worked at an abattoir and reportedly bragged about slaughtering the animals, saying that is what he enjoyed most. Bunting was the ringleader of a degenerate subculture of murderers whose victims were people they already knew, which, again, is also a rather interesting aspect of him, seeing as most serial killers do not attack or target people they know or know very well. In fact, they are much more likely to attack a stranger. Under the instruction of Bunting, the group would prey upon the weak so they could steal their welfare payments. Again, also me leading that this group was actually not a group of serial killers, but in fact more opportunistic killers. Bunting's crime led to the longest and most expensive investigation and criminal trials in South Australian history, not an easy feat. Bunting lived in Murray Bridge, South Australia from November 1991, living on Loham Street, sorry if I botched that, until he moved to Burton King, again, sorry if I botched, Avenue in May of 1997, where he remained until September of 1998. Two of his victims were found in the backyard of his former home in Waterloo Corner Road, Southbury North, a northern suburb of Adelaide, when the remaining 8 discovered in a vault of the bank that was rented out by Bunting and Hayden in Snowtown, South Australia, about 140 kilometers north of Adelaide. Bunting insisted on playing the 1994 live album Throwing Copper during many of his later murders, in fact. Bunting, interestingly enough, also did show premeditation, as he had fashioned what he called a rock spider wall on a wall of a spare room in his home. The chart created using paper notes and wool and even some string was an interconnected web of names of people Bunting suspected to be pedophiles or homosexuals. At times, Bunting would randomly select a name from the wall and call them, insinuating they were pedophiles and would get what's coming to them. Now, his relationship with James Velasquez. Bunting was married to one Elizabeth Harvey, mother of co-offender James Velasquez. Bunting spent a lot of time with James, assuming the role of a father figure. Bunting regularly communicated to James his hatred of pedophiles and homosexuals. James actually confided in Bunting that his stepfather from a previous marriage, Troy Yode, had molested him at the age of 13. Bunting replied by suggesting that Yode be bashed, or murdered. James later gave evidence against Bunting, Wagner, and Hayden at their criminal trials. Elizabeth Harvey, however, has since died of cancer, unfortunately. Bunting's relationship with Don Wagner, he actually met when he moved to Waterloo Corner Road. Wagner was living with Barry Lane at the time. Both men assisted Bunting in disposing of the body of his first victim, Clinton Tresnis. I'm sorry if I botched that again. Wagner later assisted Bunting in the remaining 10 murders, though it is unsure if Barry Lane was aware of the other murders. Now, Clinton, being one of the first victims, Bunting's murder spree actually began in August of 1992 with the murder of Clinton, who was age 22 at the time. He was bashed to death with a shovel in Bunting's living room after being invited inside for a social visit. Bunting accused Clinton of being a pedophile and referred to him in conversations after his murder as Happy Pants for whatever reason. Clinton was found buried 2 years after his murder in a shallow grave, August 16th of 1994, at Lower Light, South Australia. It was another 3 years before Bunting murdered again. Now, Clinton's murder remained unsolved for some time, and in 1997 he was the subject of 2 episodes of the Australian television show Australia's Most Wanted, very similar actually to America's Most Wanted here in the States. Bunting watched an episode of the show with Velasquez, meaning James, and his mother. Bunting boasted to James, "That's my handiwork," and revealed to James that he had murdered Clinton while living at Waterloo Corner Road, Southbury, and that he disposed of Clinton's body in Lower Light with Wagner and Lane's assistance. The next victim was a Ray Davids, who was an intellectually disabled man who lived in a caravan behind the house of Susan Allen in Southbury North. Now, Ray, a former lover of Allen, became the target for Allen after Allen accused him of making sexual advances towards her grandsons. Davis was murdered by Bunting and Wagner in December of 1995 and was never reported missing. Bunting and Wagner were later seen cleaning David's caravan. They moved it to a house in nearby Elizabeth, where it was painted and sold 2 months after David's murder. Bunting continued to claim David's welfare payments, however. David's body was later recovered by the police in the backyard at the former home of Bunting in Waterloo Corner North, Southbury North. I would hate to be the new homeowner of that particular home, if it's even still standing. The next victim was a Michael Gardner, I'm sorry if I botched these names, was an openly gay man who was murdered by Bunting and Wagner in August of 1997. Gardner shared a house with some friends nearby. Robert Wagner did not like Gardner due to his open homosexuality. After Gardner's murder, Bunting had Frederick Brooks call friends of Gardner's and impersonate him. Brooks demanded that they give him the belongings, such as Gardner's wallet, saying Gardner required it for identification purposes. Bunting wanted it to gain access to Gardner's personal funds, however. His body was found by police stored in one of the 6 drums in the bank vault in Snowtown. The body of Barry Lane was also located in the same barrel. One of Gardner's feet had been removed so that the lid of the drum could be closed. Barry Lane, who was also an open homosexual and cross-dresser, Lane had previously been in a relationship with Robert Wagner from 1985 until 1996. The pair shared a house in Brigham Road, Southbury North, near the home of Bunting. Lane's relationship with Wagner began when Wagner was 13, and he was last seen alive October 1997. Bunting often referred to Lane as being dirty and as a pedophile. On the day of his murder, Lane was forced by Bunting to call his mother. He told her he would be moving to Queensland and that he wanted nothing further to do with her. Bunting also had learned of Lane telling others of the earlier murder of Clinton. Lane had assisted Bunting to conceal Clinton's body. After Lane's murder, Bunting assumed control of Lane's vehicle and claimed his welfare payments. Thomas Trelvin was also involved in the murder of Lane. It was alleged Bunting only associated with Lane to gain further information about pedophiles in the area. Lane's dismembered body was found by police in a drum in the bank vault in Snowtown, along with the body of Michael Gardner. Thomas Trevelyan, if I botched that again, I apologize, was described as having psychiatric problems and wore only army-style clothing. He would at times run outside his house with a knife if he heard an unfamiliar noise, and was known to regularly travel long distances on foot. He shared a house with Barry Lane for a period of 5 months, from April to October of 97. He had assisted Bunting and Wagner in the earlier murder of Barry Lane. Bunting murdered him after finding out he told others of his involvement in Lane's murder. Bunting told others that Trevelyan had started to fuck up and go mental, and that he would be a risk. Trevelyan was driven to Kurtzbrook in the Adelaide Hills by Bunting and Wagner. He was forced to stand in a box while a noose was fastened around his neck, and the box was then kicked out from under him. Trevelyan's body was found on the 5th of November, 1997. Police initially treated his death as a suicide, but later changed their minds. Garvin Porter was age 31 and was a friend of Velasquez from Victoria. He moved into the house shared by Bunting and Velasquez in 1988. Bunting referred to Porter as a heroin addict, as a waste who no longer deserved to live. As you can see, his taste in victims did scatter a bit. Bunting was angered after being pricked by a used syringe discarded by Porter on the sofa. Porter was murdered by Bunting and Wagner while sleeping in his car in the driveway of Bunting's home after working on his car. Porter's body was stored in a barrel before being moved to Snowtown. Troy Eude was the half-brother of Velasquez and had earlier confided to Bunting that Eude had molested him when younger. In August of 1998, Bunting, Wagner, Velasquez, and Hayden visited Eude. Bunting, Wagner, and Velasquez actually dragged him from his bed and murdered him. Eude's body was dismembered and stored in a barrel that would be later moved to Snowtown. Frederick Brooks was the intellectually disabled son of Jody Elliott and nephew of Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of the convicted murderer Hayden. He was murdered by Bunting, Wagner, and Velasquez on the 17th of September in 1998. Brooks' body was moved to a car, which was later collected by Mark Hayden. The body was later located by police in the bank vault in Snowtown, as were several others. Mark Hayden continued to access the welfare payments of Brooks, however. Gary O'Dwyer was 29 and was an intellectually disabled man who lived alone on Francis Street, Murray Bridge. His disabilities arose from a car accident earlier in life. Bunting had Velasquez learn personal information about O'Dwyer and whether he had any family. O'Dwyer was seen by Bunting as an easy target and murdered so Bunting could gain his welfare payments. O'Dwyer's body was found by police again in the bank vault in Snowtown. His body contained burn marks, however, which were inflicted by the use of a machine to apply electric shocks. Elizabeth Hayden, the wife of Mark Hayden, and shared a house with him and Bunting at Blackham Crescent, Smithfield Plains, a northern suburb of Adelaide. Elizabeth is said to have been killed in her own home while her husband was out, but no further details about her death could be found. David Johnson, age 24, he died in May of 1999, was Velasquez's half-brother, murdered by Bunting in the bank building, having been lured there by Velasquez for the promise of a cheap computer. He was the only victim to have died in Snowtown. Now, I do recall I did promise you details on cannibalism, didn't I? Not to worry, my horde, I did find such details, though it wasn't easy. The single account of cannibalism by the Snowtown serial murderers was upon one of the last victims of the slaughter. Details of the cannibalism of David Johnson were revealed by none other than James Velasquez. during a police interview before he was arrested for his role in the killings. According to Velasquez, Bunting and Wagner hacked at the man's body to make sure it would fit in the barrel, and then hacked off a sliver of flesh from his right thigh. They then heated a frying pan and cooked the flesh and ate it. No further details, however, were mentioned. The investigation began to take shape when Elizabeth Hayden's brother reported her missing within days of her disappearance. Her brother did not believe Mark's explanations for her disappearance, which were shaky at best. I do believe he stated that she tended to go off and was probably with another man, which did not fit Elizabeth's personality. Now, Mark Hayden's explanations for her disappearance also seemed to contradict each other, the variations he gave, and the brother also did not believe she would leave without her 2 young sons. Police found it suspicious that her husband had not reported her missing and investigated her disappearance. Elizabeth Hayden was closely affiliated with all of the murderers, so they fell under close scrutiny once the police started their investigations. The discovery of Therese and Lane had known each other was one of the first clues in the police discovering that there were more than just a routine missing persons investigation. The storage of the bodies. The discovery of the barrels in May of 1999 in Snowtown was the culmination of 5 years of criminal investigation. Police involvement with the then unlinked crimes had begun with the discovery of human remains in the lower light. After Elizabeth Hayden's disappearance, the police insisted on listening to a device in Mark Hayden's house in Smithfield Plains, recordings from which were later used as court evidence, though that would not be able to be done in the United States without some serious evidence and a warrant. The remains found at Lower Light were later determined to have been those of Clinton Tremiz, who had been murdered in Bunting's living room at Salisbury North, South Australia. Ray Davis and Susan Allen were found buried in the backyard of that house. Now, Susan Allen, and I'm sure you've probably realized I have listed 13 victims instead of 12. Well, you see, one of those victims, I believe it was Susan Allen, is not proven to have been killed by anyone. In fact, it is believed she had a heart attack. The only thing they were charged there was basically dismembering a corpse to hide her body and to continue to collect on her welfare payments. The bodies in barrels were vexatiously stored in several places before finally being moved to the bank vault in Snowtown. These included a shed behind Bunting's house at Murray Bridge in April of '98. The 3 barrels were then moved to Hayden's property in Smithfield Plains. Then 5 barrels were stored in a Toyota Land Cruiser at Holyton, a locality on the Adelaide Plains near Clare Valley, with a 6th in Mitsubishi Sigma back at Murray Bridge. Both of these vehicles were later moved to Snowtown, and afterwards the barrels were moved into the bank vault, which had been rented by Hayden using the name Mark Lawrence, the name he had used before he had married. And seeing as not all of these locations actually did belong to Bunting or anyone involved in the murder, I was rather curious as to what he said to get people to store these foul-smelling barrels for him. And I have to say, I couldn't have thought of a more Australian thing to tell these people than telling them that he had hit a couple of kangaroos, which is actually quite common, and was storing them in barrels as he felt bad and didn't just want to toss them to the side of the road. I have to say, That is quite ingenious, though I'm not entirely shocked. The movement of unfamiliar vehicles, however, in Snowtown, it being a small town where strangers do tend to stand out, and loading activity at the old bank that led into the bank building being searched. Of the Snowtown location, one local police source said, "From what I understand, there was no person involved in these murders from within Snowtown or the surrounding district. They were murdered elsewhere, and these drums were brought to Snowtown because it was a quiet little town and where there was a premise idea for the person involved." Examiners attempting to identify the remains found them mummified rather than dissolved, the latter being the apparent intention of storing the bodies in barrels of acid. The killers had chosen hydrochloric acid, which actually mummified the remains. Not a smart idea. The trials, after a series of pre-trial hearings, the first of the accused to be sentenced was Velasquez and was given 4 life sentences on June 21st, 2001, after pleading guilty to 4 murders. Later that summer, Bunting, Hayden, and Wagner each pleaded not guilty to 10 counts of murder. Many of the charges against Hayden were later dropped due to insufficient evidence. The Supreme Court trial of Wagner and Bunting began on October 14th of 2002, and within a short space of time the court experienced difficulties with the jury. At least one juror refused to continue due to the horror of the evidence, and some sources report that a total of 3 jurors withdrew from the panel for the same reason. Both Bunting and Wagner were found guilty on September 8, 2003. Bunting was convicted of 11 murders. Wagner, who had pled guilty to 3 murders, was convicted of 7. Both appealed their convictions. They were each sentenced to imprisonment for life on each count that had been served cumulatively. The presiding judge, Justice Brian Martin, stated that the men were in the business of killing for pleasure and were also incapable of true rehabilitation, which I, again, agree. The proceeding against Hayden continued into 2004, and on August 2nd, a trial opened in which he was charged with 2 counts of murder and 6 counts of assisting offenders. Hayden testified that he was not party to the crimes. However, on December 19th, the jury returned from 4 days of deliberation, convicting Hayden of 5 counts of assisting in the crimes and reaching no verdict on the 2 counts of murder. And the remaining charge of assistance, Hayden was held in detention as of December 2004, awaiting a possible retrial. In May 2005, the Supreme Court dismissed an appeal by Bunting and Wagner, who have now exhausted their avenues of appeal in South Australia. In September 2005, the murder charges against Hayden were dropped in return for guilty pleas to 2 new charges of assisting in the killing of his wife, which was not entirely proven, was Elizabeth Hayden and Troy Yude. Prosecutors agreed to drop an additional charge of assisting offenders in relation to the murder of David Johnson. The final outstanding murder charges against John Bunting and Robert Wagner concerning Susan Allen were dropped on May 7, 2007, when a jury was unable to reach a verdict. The community impact, however, I find to be the most unfortunate. Bunting and Wagner have been described alongside backpacker murderer killer Ivan Milat as Australians' worst serial killers. The particulars of the case, especially the manner of which the victims were found, horrified and fascinated the public. The murders garnered Snowtown much unwanted attention, however, and the town is now best known for those murders. According to local residents, in the 18 months following the discovery in the discussed bank vault, a steady stream of unwelcome visitors would stop and look at the photograph the building. At the time, the local press reported a suggestion that the town's name be changed to avoid the stigma now associated with it. Although the suggestion was never acted upon, one suggested the new name in the press reports was Rosetown. The house in Salisbury North was owned by the South Australian Housing Trust and has since been demolished. And that, my lovelies, is all the time I have for you today, and is the end of our story. I hope you enjoyed our conversation. Until next time, my murderous horde, blessed be, and stay classy.